We're talking Rhythm Tengoku, fan-translated as Rhythm Heaven Silver, the first humble entry of its series, and what I consider an underdog gem of the rhythm game market, for being a remarkably succinct and adorably intimate music game on the go. Don't underestimate this one, is what I'm getting at. It's cute looking and colorful, sure, but it isn't afraid to challenge your timing in ways that nurture your natural sense of rhythm and ways that unlock its more unrealized potential. May not be endorsed by a celebrity singer or band to guarantee its playlist as a default crowd pleaser, but its main composer and producer Sunku, renowned in the Japanese music industry as the lead singer for the rock group Sharam Q, and the overall producer, composer, lyricist, everythingist of idol supergroups like Morning Musume, he uses his experience to create some of the best tunes on the Game Boy Advance. Trust me, if at some point you've ever been turned off by the blaring bleeps of GBA music in other games, you'll be in a state of awe when you tune into Rhythm Tengoku and realize you're basically playing out a banger of a vocal track. Lastly, and most important to this video, is its apparatus. It may not have any of those heavy-handed guitar or instrument accessories or uncanny human character models to make you live out the musical roleplay, but those built-in handheld controls just make everything work like second nature, man. It feels good to play a music game with a traditional control scheme. Nothing external, heavy-handed, or technical distracting you from enjoying this chibi musical experience. On that note, it's the kind of music game that's appealing for how it shaves off all of the excess of its genre. A music game with no score counters, no dedicated instrument visual or heads-up display, no flashy button prompts, no stolen footage of anime openings in the background. I think of the visual concept of playing popular rhythm games, and what comes to mind are these, grandiose, complicated setups at your friends' living room parties, or staring at your bedroom monitor all alone, being hypnotized by the act of mousing over insane amounts of flashing circles and gratuitous numbers. Or smartphone gacha games even. Those all have their own niche, their own charm in the right circumstances, and if you're the right person. But all Rhythm Tengoku had to share was its petite and unique animated self. Something that I can always come back to. And as I dove into its quirky worlds, made them naturally thrive in rhythm, I found a very self-reflexive game where my own personal sense of rhythm was being put into practice. This was a game pitched to Nintendo by Sunku to encourage Japanese audiences at the time to practically train their inherent sense of rhythm, in a time when it seems like most music games weren't really attentive to things like precise timing or training, in favor of just selling the spectacle. To give some background as to why this intention matters, it's worth noting that Tengoku came out at around the time that the first Brain Age game arrived on Nintendo DS, at least in Japan. And I'd say it's a fitting counter to that sort of game, an educational, quality of life experience unlike Brain Age, that didn't need to brand itself through proven scholarly methods or quantitative neuroscience reasoning for why your rhythm is at a certain calculated level, didn't even need to put its educated inspiration as top billing. Rhythm Tengoku really didn't care about teaching or preaching or being prescribed software. It exhibited itself as a vicarious way to open up your rhythmic sensibilities, video gamey empathy over contrived edutainment. Play these charming minigames, and your relationship with rhythm will just naturally dawn on you. Literally starting the game takes you through this deliberately tedious rhythm test where you operate some machine that prints out some lame-o calculation of when you tap too early or too late to the given pattern, then it gives you a stupidly large decimal score to rub it in. Then what does the game do? Puts that aside, tells you that, hey, score stuff ain't important. We believe your rhythm will mature as you go through, but overall, just enjoy yourself. Here's some fun-ass minigames. Point being that it may have been inspired by the IQ testing and demonstrative approach that Brain Age made popular, but it knew how to be a game first and foremost, not homework. Undeniably, it is one of the most friendly and likable music games out there. And keep in mind that this was, and still technically is, a Japanese exclusive, the last Nintendo published game for the GBA. And yet, elementary school Canada-bound me was able to get down with it on a GBA emulator through a USB stick loaded onto a super old PC in the computer lab, played with sluggish keyboard controls. I may have started with a different and actually legible and playable Rhythm Heaven, but I still loved every minute of playing Tengoku. It's just that good on its own merits. Let me unfold my cards to the table right now. I am not a good singer. You're here, there's nothing I'm here. At all. I have like no right to brag about my skills or anything like that. I have like no conviction to pick up and learn an instrument, and I'm definitely surrounded by a lot of musically talented choir or band attending friends who can probably outclass me in every regard. But even despite my lack of musical prowess or integrity, I think it speaks to the game's charm and effectiveness that someone like me, and plenty of other fans of the series who aren't super musically inclined, can still enjoy the hell out of Rhythm Heaven. Beyond language barriers, or even a player's experience or lack of music theory, Tengoku proves that rhythm is free game to anyone and anything. This is a very import-friendly game, let alone a music game that just exudes pure and direct generosity right from its gameplay. Everything about the experience is communicated to you thoroughly. You'll grow accustomed to its sharp and responsive sound effects and satisfied in-game sprites for when you know you're getting it right, and more disruptive and discouraging sounds and animations if you aren't up to snuff. These are expressive, cartoony scenarios with a reasonably rhythmic purpose that do a damn good job at responding to your input, showing that your actions are instrumental to their function, like punching stuff as a karate man doodle to get his flow meter at max, and grant him the strength to punch boulders. Or even more simple things like marching competently with cadets and being the correct third clap in a clapping trio, making those a reality through rhythm. While most of these minigames amount to just get the performance done in one piece, I do appreciate how these games have a visibly pleasing and cleanly element to them. Take for instance plucking the disgusting hairs off of these frickin' onions as they conclude with a clean and ecstatic face. You get that cha-ching sound effect every time you complete an onion to really hammer in that productivity feeling. Or the tension of the samurai slicing game where you gotta defeat bouncy demons as the tempo gets progressively faster. It's stressful. There's fog that comes up to block your vision. It basically forces you into a desperate situation, dwelling in patience, and it all culminates on a slow tempo showdown against the elder demons. When you're done going through all of that, your samurai character calms down and breathes a sigh of relief. You did it, buddy. Or more uplifting things like in Space Dance, where you get your uptight yellow midget of a leader who barely busts a move to join you and your quartet in the contagious groove in the cosmos. By making it a point that rhythm isn't always a trivial means to an end, but a natural, uplifting, positive force for the satisfaction and encouragement of others, playing and getting good at Tengoku is nothing short of a chill and motivating time. Compared to the kind of stale score meters and result screens you usually see in music games that interrogate every aspect of your performance to prove your worth, the feedback in Tengoku is very understated and direct. It acts more like a genuine talk, a friendly commentary on the fiction more than a strict assessment of your inputs, if that makes sense. It's more about, hey, you made this one thing look really cool, rather than you did X amount of things Y times, therefore you are graded like this. As long as you're consistent with what the game teaches you, you will get those mix-ups, and you will get recognized for being superb. Even if you're playing more ordinarily, but still show signs of improvements when it comes to catching the game's more advanced moments, you'll get an okay rating, which counts as a forgiving pass. Hell, if you're struggling on one minigame for a number of times, you can go to the barista and he will allow you to skip it and move on to the next minigame if you really want to. Though the responsibility of superbing it and perfecting it is still on you. I guess you could call this the precursor to something like the super guides in modern Nintendo platformers, and while it's more patronizing there and discussed in a derogatory way in the context of an actively challenging action game, it makes more sense in a practice makes perfect playground music game like Rhythm Tengoku. Sometimes you're just not feeling it, or you're having an off day in your gameplay session, so just move on to something new, maybe even revisit something you've accomplished, instead of dwelling on stuff that's giving you a hard time. That attitude that empathizes with the player is why I loved modern challenges like Celeste, and it's why I loved and still love completing Rhythm Tengoku. May seem weird or off-putting from the get-go, you might even get intimidated over how tutorializing the first playthrough is and how some of the mix-ups sneak up on you. Thing is, I just can't think of these brief slices of rhythmic life as a one-and-done deal to get it over with. As long as you stick with it, if you have the willingness to apply yourself and rehearse the performance to see it through to the end, you'll realize that every move that these minigames present to you, even the hardest looking patterns that seem impossible, are 100% doable. And that picture-perfect performance will be something that you own one day, something that effectively becomes etched into your mind and doable on command. That is what I feel is really happening when you get into a Rhythm Heaven game. Essentially, I just like it for avoiding the stress or indifference of cluttered gameplay and calculated results. I like that it's with you in every step of the way without discrediting your own growth as a player. From the welcoming variety of ways to practice your rhythm, to the simple conversations about rhythmic moments in life you have with the barista. It all shows that rhythm can be developed by anyone who has the patience to do it. All of this could not have been possible or encouraging without the effectiveness of its control scheme and the clear-cut nature of what types of activities you're doing in Tengoku. It's just you, the A button, and the D-pad. Sometimes the B button chimes in, but it's all you need to make it all happen. It also helps that Tengoku's games are very straightforward and easy to relate to. The bulk of the game is mostly about characters dancing together in place and feeling good in the musical bubble they're found in. So you really get to take in this minimal and wholesome perspective of their enjoyable lives, like the Toss friends who toss volleyballs at each other while happily standing on GBA button platforms, or clapping at the Bonadori as the shy glasses girl as the karaoke style lyrics come in and everyone just sings along happily. Their situations may not be much in terms of scope or even excitement, but I can't help but like that they're just there doing their little thing. You come to appreciate how internally blissful their existences are, and you see so many of these brief rhythmic hotspots back to back that the game just feels like a nice little road trip across different ends of this limitless heaven. I guess that's a feeling that resonates with me as the greatest trait of my favorite handheld games. The sense of traveling to strange places that sooner or later become yours to know. Then the remixes come into play and it's like worlds colliding. These closely knit minigames that once felt so separate from its neighbors in the set suddenly find themselves cooperating in these challenging montage sections. You wouldn't think that a germ fighting minigame and a Bonadori could work together in a Mamba tune, but Rhythm Tengoku finds a way. It's like as if they're all occurring in tandem despite their aesthetic differences. They make amends by being all part of the same performance, acting as one, just in opposite ends of the Rhythm Heaven universe. It's another example of the game honing in on that welcoming and harmonious sensation of being a part of a community. It pulls that off really well. In fact, it reminds me a lot of another game from a video I did before my hiatus. Yep, this GBA classic that actually did come to the West was what most of Tengoku's development team worked on 3 years prior. If you recall, that game felt so special to me because of how it put the community of the WarioWare universe front and center. It framed the reason for why you're playing stupid, silly microgames. How Wario, his friends, their daily lives in Diamond City, and their roles as hosts to face off against made players like me addicted to the arcade gameplay and seemingly befriended with its earnest setup. It was more than weird and random. It showed that its formal identity could reach out and motivate the player. It demonstrated signs of being impressively cool and exceptionally presented for such a silly, arcadey GBA game, to make playing the package something more than just a weird and random piece of software as a means to an end. It was family, man. And likewise, Rhythm Tengoku not only frames playing minigames around likable characters, its gameplay is actively about thriving with these characters. Let me put it this way. Through your inputted rhythm, the little stick figure guy in space can unlock all of the hearts from the blue staircases, making all the stars in the sky come to life and allow him to reach the top of the staircase and claim his magical scepter. Also through your rhythm, the rats will be able to avoid being caught by the gigantic cat in the distance and rightfully claim their cheese. The game takes you to the weirdest places and even the more mundane ones, and proves that no matter what you're doing or where you end up, rhythm can apply anywhere and anytime, and can bring all of us together in harmony. At least when it does show actual relatable characters, and it does play out in actual relatable harmony. Where I think Rhythm Tengoku fell short from perfection, and why I believe the game never got the priority for localization back in 2006, is that Tengoku sometimes tries out ideas too prematurely. It's the most obvious when seeing how its majority of excellent original minigames often have to accompany more experimental minigames with not very exceptional things happening, like its everyday fireworks, but they're in rhythm. It's balls hopping on these stick things, but they're in rhythm. Blocks and cylinders in rhythm. That's about it. It's got a circus theme. You like circus? It'll make you think of the cylinders and the blocks. Doesn't it make you think of that? See, I feel the game is at its peak when it introduces minigames that get you invested with unique sprites and backdrops to align with. You form a small bond with the game's characters and get a worthwhile, intimate performance in the brief time you get to play their stage. That way, when you arrive at the end game that is comprised of sequel minigames, you feel a considerable growth in environment and identity from the characters you've come to know. The Clapping Trio, one of the first games you play, transforms into a western show with fast claps, and they finally took off their afros. The Sarge, who scolds you in the fairly generic Marcher minigame that you first play, gets their comeuppance by being the ones who march in the sequel minigame, in embarrassing bunny suits no less. And then the Rap Women come into play, and they rap about stealing the Rap Women's snacks. Like, it's perfect. Like the appeal of WarioWare, that's what brings you back and makes the package feel lively. But these more abstract and dull minigames end up feeling like roadblocks to full-on intimacy with the Rhythm Heaven universe. They're not terrible, just out of place and something I'd rather not waste my patience getting to know. Why should I care about a quiz minigame where all the two characters do is play a worthless counting game where they count how many times they press the buttons? What does this have to do with rhythm? Am I supposed to find them fluid and charming because their arms look nicely animated? Because the result screen makes up for their lack of characterization in-game? At least the stale and boring blankness of the calligraphy minigame has the courtesy to give you little dancing sprites as you're playing by the second half, but why couldn't we get complete and expressive characters to decorate and give energy to these ordinary concepts? And even in some of the more character-centric minigames, I feel they're not given as much time in the limelight to get the full picture of their quality. The best minigames have a clear introduction, a steady middle section, and a satisfying conclusion. You get every facet, every mix-up of their gameplay, and soak in the candid narrative of their minigame. But the static nature of some of these minigames often refuses that sort of escalation. What you start with usually ends up with where you started. The Trampoline minigame has two shape-shifting friends doing tricks in front of a wowed crowd, and by the end, they just kinda end up in the same place. The crowd never changes their expression, and the two are in the same idle bouncing animation that they were in from the start. Some cool tricks may have been pulled off, but there's no real visible difference aside from the fact that you're now done the minigame. This is also compounded by the fact that these games tend to stop when they feel like it, as opposed to properly finish by the end. Like, the music loop is still going, but by the end it fades out and we're at the results screen already. Imagine if Stages in Sonic Forces were a music game. I think the most tragic minigame for me is Showtime. This adorable monkey with a hammer learns 3 different cues in the tutorial, every cue introducing you to a new wacky penguin with a satisfying ball-catching animation. And the actual game lasts for barely a minute, and is only featured once in its remix with only 2 of its 3 cues being showcased. Couldn't even get a sequel minigame? Why not squeeze out the potential of this unique team-up and cues like some of the other minigames do? This imbalance also extends to the remixes, which admittedly I do find fun overall. Of course, the vocal remixes are the highlight of quality, and while not as extravagant, I like the simple loops of the other ones. But because each remix has to be comprised of 5 different minigames, they sometimes struggle with how to make each of those games worth the representation. Sometimes you'll be playing one minigame way too much, and barely play a different minigame more than once. Now, in fairness to the remixes, they are allowed to utilize their given minigames in whatever fashion or quantity they want. It is supposed to be the unpredictable challenge run of the game after all. I just wish there was more balancing in mind to make these lesser minigames and remixes more realized and complete, rather than tolerable at worst. Being the first game in a series, Tengoku, like a lot of first games, shows some awkward spots in trying to form that confident characterization and identity that I know it could do, which probably explains why it failed to make the jump to localization. And no, not just because of the more obvious conclusions that people would come to, like how it was a GBA game that came out when the DS was being launched, thereby guaranteeing its failure and getting a wide audience. Keep in mind that Tengoku did prove to be successful in sales for what it was, seeing how it kicked off the franchise, despite being something entirely original and on a handheld on the verge of dying out. It even inspired an arcade port from Sega to stretch its property further. Not to mention, backwards compatibility with GBA games was always a marketed and important feature of the DS. In fact, an article from Wire.com highlighted Tengoku being sold in DS packaging alongside other DS games, so I don't think being on the GBA was its biggest problem. And anything you want to say about Japanesey imagery scaring off Western audiences, making localization more difficult, well, I just refer you to Cat and Anna's stage in WarioWare, a game that did make it to the West. Even back then, I was a Bionics watching Inuyasha obsessed kid. I would eat this shit up without hesitation. But putting that aside, my personal observation when it comes to Tengoku's identity is that it just didn't have itself fully figured out yet, and it definitely couldn't get away with the kind of mix-matching in styles that WarioWare successfully curated in its game. Western Nintendo audiences could get down with weirdo, random, occasionally uncomfortable microgames because they were organized and grounded by the classic character Wario and his friends you end up getting to know. And I'm just not sure if that same audience could handle the unfiltered variety of something like Rhythm Tengoku at the time. But again, these are merely awkward spots. They are moments or decisions that may rub me the wrong way, but at the end of the day, I can take it in stride for at least trying to formulate its identity, and for the most part, succeeding in what it wanted to do. Because those high points, those moments when a minigame does feature a complete and charming scenario, when a remix beautifully blends its parts into an amazing handheld music video experience, when the game just lets you play a drumming simulator with actual lessons and a freestyle mode. These are absolutely worth getting to, and are still really fun to tinker around with and master up to now. To give you an idea of how well this game is held up, let me just say that there are some music games out there that age like expired milk, where no matter how charming the exterior looks, they just flop over their poor communication towards timing and general lack of substantial content to make up for those awkward shortcomings. So any charm that may come from the game tripping on a puddle once in a while can't come unscathed without some frustrating compromises you gotta put up with. Rhythm Tengoku does not have this issue. Even when the game gets a little experimental and a little weird, it still has its consistent responsiveness, earnest execution, and admirable variety to pick up the slack. This is a novel box of chocolates that you can still pick up and savor even today. But even up to now, I find it to be a sublime handheld music game that I think anyone can and should give a shot, especially in this current age that has graced us with excellent fan translations and great homebrew methods to emulate it on modern handhelds. Play it on a real handheld and you can just feel how much more precise your in-game button presses become, and how much more crisp the chibi sprite presentation looks when it's in this bite-sized format. Kudos to the 3DS hardware too, which, fun fact, isn't technically emulating GBA games since they are injected into its built-in backwards compatibility with the DS, which in itself has built-in GBA hardware, meaning you get a pretty accurate execution of how the games would play on an actual Game Boy Advance. Now, aside from some strange hiccups in between transitioning minigames in some of the remixes, this is my favorite way to experience Tengoku. There is also just straight up playing the remastered versions of Tengoku's best games found in Rhythm Heaven Megamix for the Nintendo 3DS, but we can talk more about that in some other year, or two, or more. But revisiting Rhythm Tengoku still managed to be pleasant and amiable in a way that you don't see in a lot of music games, both past and present. Even the ones that I hold in high regard can't top its innocent appeal. It's in the way it levels with you. It doesn't need to prove itself by wowing you with a spectacle or accessories, but instead gets you accustomed to fun little scenarios that get you involved. You learn to love it and make it happen. Again, this was a very self-reflexive game that you wouldn't think would happen on a legacy Super Nintendo port-bound handheld like the GBA, but I feel it was the definitive maturation point of the Game Boy Advance era. From using handhelds as a sanctuary platform for classic 2D side-scrollers when consoles were proliferating spectacular 3D experiences, slowly injecting console-quality personality, attention to branding, and metatextual framing into its games, until reaching this final frontier of pure character, pure musical inspiration, pure involvement with the player's interactivity, a perfect transition point to the Nintendo DS library, in a genre that may seem so overwhelming for its inclination towards the material, the pop culture, the hardcore, the VIP only for specific taste or musical skill. This was a game that cut through that bullshit and said, hey, we can all have a good time in a world of rhythm.